We have a few more wiring harness to disconnect. So this is a vacuum line and the mass airflow sensor. We just want to strap this together so they remain close to the engine. Over here we have another set of wires. This is also for engine control. So now we want to lube this to ease the pressure of removing it. We must never forget, we do not want to tug on the wire when disconnecting the plug. We always want to make sure we're pulling on the plug. If the plug should not become detached by pulling on it, then you will have to insert a screwdriver between the socket and the plug for removal. You see, this harness has never been unplugged since it came from the factory, so that's what's causing frustration in removing it. Here we have a 10mm ground for disconnection. Okay, so we must remember to return the bolt from where we remove it, because this is going to ease our memory when it comes to replacing the bolt. We also have to unshackle or unstrap the harness from its retainer clip on the side. This will place the harness up against the engine. We want to basically just secure the wire with the engine. We don't want it to be hanging, because when the engine is going to be lifted for removal, we don't want this plug to get caught in the chassis and then rip apart. Time to remove the air-conditioned compressor pump from the engine, because we want to save the gas inside the system. So what we will do in most cases is we will detach the compressor pump from the engine and simply just lay it to the side. Since our system is empty and there is no freon gas inside, we're going to disconnect the hose for the air conditioned compressor pump. This will make us not have to remove the pump from the engine, making removal of the engine much easier. Okay, so this is all aluminum, and you're going to want to be careful, as some people like to say, aluminium, because you're going to require something to pry this line off of its compressor. So you see this has a hose or a O-ring seal that's restricting it from becoming removed. In some event, you're able to just pull it off with your hands like that. So you want to just lay this to the side. Okay, here we can see we have another ground strap. So I'm going to release that, detach it from the air compressor strap, because we want this stainless steel strap to remain. We want this stainless steel strap to remain with the engine. So we'll lift this line out of here, put it to the side. That is the temporary position of the air condition line, so the engine can be removed. This is our final routing for the harness by securing it behind this dipstick up in this area. We don't want this wire to be flopping around because it could break the wire internally, and that could cause problem when restarting the engine. To safeguard against our nut becoming lost, I like to replace them. Also, we're going to need to plug the port of the air conditioned compressor. I like to use some paper towel, but it's not advisable that you use paper towel. You could locate plastic or rubber plug to replace the paper towel. We must also not forget to plug the inlet spout for the power steering pump. We also want to replace the bolt for the negative ground cable. The best way for disconnecting the brake vacuum hose is from the brake booster. This way it could simply remain on the engine. Now we have to disconnect the accelerator cable, and we want to remove this completely from the vehicle, also from the firewall, to prevent it from breaking. We also must remove the evap purge hose. Once the brake vacuum hose has been disconnected from its port, this is the best position for placing it. Now we want to remove the accelerator cable, 2 10mm bolts, detach it from its linkage, removal from the firewall, and unhooking from the accelerator pedal. This is going to be another complicated part of the video, and that's part in removing this upper Plenum manifold. In the video description, you're going to see a video link on how to remove this upper Plenum manifold. It is mandatory that this Plenum be removed in order to take this engine out of its compartment. Once this Plenum manifold is removed, we will be able to gain access to the back between the firewall and the transmission bell housing. We have to remove some bolts that attach the bell housing to the engine block. This is going to help release the engine from the transmission for removal. But what I have in my hand here is the accelerator cable, and this is going to need complete removal from the vehicle. Also, the 2 bolts that holds the cable to the firewall back there, you're going to have to take that out of there and put them in a secure area. You do not want to replace those bolts. So once this cable is installed, you have this plastic retainer which is going to go like this, and it holds this cable fixed to the firewall. And this part here, this white button, is what clipped in to the top of the pedal, so the pedal will be able to transfer its action through this cable. But when we look at this end of the cable, you're going to notice it looks pretty good, but when you look at it real good, you're going to see we have there's a little freighting right there going on. Let me see that? Like if I take a rag and I go like this, you see how it caught it? Well, when you apply full throttle on this accelerator cable, and let's say this is to pull all the way back, you see how it caught that rubber and pull it back? Well, what could happen here is when you step on the gas pedal like this and you release it, the gas pedal could stay like that because this little freight right here is going to remain stuck inside of the cable, and then you're going to be messing with the gas pedal and the vehicle is going to be going out of control and you're not going to know what to do. So every 100,000 miles you must inspect the accelerator cable and replace it. Mandatory. It's the most safety precaution you could take against accident and collision. All right, let's get this cable out of here. All these bolts and all the bolts that you see are being removed in this video must be pre-lube 24 hours before they can be removed. Failure to do so will most likely strip the bolt or break the studs. With the upper plenum detached from the engine, it's now time for removal. In the rear of the plenum, we will have this plug right here and this plug to disconnect. So this is the best position. We're setting up the plenum to gain access with both hands for disconnecting its electronic plug and the vacuum line. You're going to see all of this inside the video link for removing this plenum intake manifold. Replacement of this intake plenum gasket is mandatory when the plenum is going to be reinstalled. Another most important part is we want to make sure we plug these intake runner port with our paper towel. This is going to ensure that no bolts, bugs, insects, or anyone to sabotage the engine. If anything is to fall down into this runner pertaining to metal, when you start the engine, that metal will destroy the piston, the valve, the heads, and also the engine block. So this is very important. Okay, next step. This is another important part, and you're going to have to use care when doing it. We're going to have to replace, or should I say remove, this ECM wiring harness. It's going to basically get unplugged from here. Then we have to go in from inside of the vehicle to disconnect it from the computer. It is time for us to go into the vehicle on the passenger side, and what you see here is the glove box and the climate control removed, which you will find in the video link in the description. But what I want to show you here is that removal of the harness from the passenger compartment is nearly impossible because there's no clearance behind this climate control and the firewall. Plus, when you disconnect this ECM harness plug by that 10mm, that plug will not be able to pass with this additional wire and its additional plug from the firewall. Since we cannot remove the engine with its harness, the wiring harness, it's going to require us to disconnect this main harness along the top of the engine to the bottom. We want to continue removing the harness at its lowest point down where the alternator is. In the video description, you're going to see how to remove this harness from the alternator. There's a video link. It's now time to remove the rock guard from under the vehicle so we could gain access to the engine mount for removal. At the end of the alternator engine harness, we're going to notice this oil pressure switch and its plug, which will be most difficult to remove. Highly recommend that it be penetrated oil, and then we will have to use a flat screwdriver to go between the plug and the harness to basically just pry it off the sensor. We must be careful here because this could also damage the sensor plug. You're gonna have to be very careful with this plug because this is the lowest part of the vehicle, and what's gonna end up happening here is gonna get all kind of contamination and dirt inside of the socket to cause it to be restrictive to remove. Be very careful with this. can see the dirt on the socket. This rubber hose, which is connected to the front differential in the event it should be submerged in water, will not be filled with that water. This rubber hose will need disconnecting for engine removal. In the video description, you're going to see how to disconnect the end of the engine harness from the alternator by clicking on the video link below. So we're going to put this harness to the side. Now we have. So in the video description link is a video link on how to remove the alternator. With the engine starter removed, we must now remove this 10mm bolt for the transmission cooler line, which travel all along the engine oil pan and also require removal at the front of the oil pan by these two 10mm and this bracket on the side of the oil pan with another 10mm. This line will then be laid to the side as the engine is being lifted away from the compartment. The fasteners will require a 10mm 1/4" drive ratchet like this for removal of the transmission cooler line from the engine oil pan. The third 10mm bolt is held on the side of a bracket that bolts to the oil pan. With the last 10mm bolt removed from the transmission cooler line bracket, it is now possible to maneuver the line like this. So we're going to leave it in this loose condition. For when the engine is to be removed, we have to check on it, making sure that it does not become caught up on the engine mount to become broken. This is the bolt we just removed. Very important that these two short ones are to hold the bracket into the oil pan. This long one is for the transmission line at the bell housing, and these two are for holding the differential vent tube and the transmission line to its bracket. Do not install these long bolts into the engine oil pan. Here's a better look at the engine mount flange. You see how it's fractured and it's become separated. Eventually the engine is just going to fall into the frame rail, and that's going to be more problem along the drive line. So this is another important reason why we're removing the engine from its compartment, to fix this bracket and the crankshaft rear main seal. We must not forget to lube all the plastic socket for easy removal. Very important. Okay, so this plug here is going to require you to push this in like we did with this one. Since we have already disconnected the secondary oxygen sensor and remove it from the exhaust pipe for engine removal, we have to also remove the primary oxygen sensor wiring harness. We also have to remove this injector wiring harness. So we must always remember to never pull on the wire for disconnecting the plug from its socket, because this could break the wire from inside on the pin, causing more problems. Okay, now we have a zip tie here. We have to disconnect. This blue harness with the harness disconnection complete, we simply want to lay the harness to the side. The harness will now require placement to the right side of the fender inside a cloth pillowcase so it does not scratch the paint surface. This is the other half of the engine harness, which connects the alternator to the chassis for electrical. Okay, so this is the transmission harness. It is connected to the rear of the engine on this bracket right here. You see this plastic clip? It's going to require disconnecting. This harness will not be removed with the engine. This is the plastic retainer clip that holds the harness to this bracket, which has to be removed. This harness goes to the automatic transmission and will be placed to the side because it will not require removal with the engine. The transmission dipstick will require removal by this 10mm bolt, because this is going to hold the engine back from removal. This here is the starter harness. So what we want to do is we just want to strap it, secure it to this PCV pipe. This is where the transmission is basically connected internal inside the bell housing. That's the flywheel. And what we have to do is we have to rotate the crankshaft from the front harmonic balancer, because we want to position that bolt that you see right there that's holding the flywheel to the torque converter. This is very important that these bolts be disconnected in order for the engine to be removed. But to gain access to that bolt, we're going to have to remove those two 14mm bolts. Will have to be removed in order for that bracket to detach from the engine block and the transmission housing to make disconnection of the torque converter bolt possible. The removal of the 14mm bolt will require you to position the ratchet like this. Positioning of this extension on the handle of the ratchet is most important for releasing the bolt or risk cutting your hand on the side of the oil pan. We have two more bolts to release for removing the bracket from the engine. In some case, these bolts, which are 14mm, will require cleaning with some form of degreaser before the socket can be perfectly placed onto them to prevent stripping condition and preventing removal. If you don't have anything like shop compressed air, you could always use this heavy-duty electrical parts degreaser for cleaning those bolts to fit your socket properly. That is the cleanliness that we want of the bolt before the 14mm socket can be installed with the ratchet. The best way for removing that bolt would be to place the box end of the combination wrench at this angle and pulling its leverage to the left or down. Before the bolt can be untightened, you will most likely want to position it like this, hanging your weight off of the wrench to untorque the bolt. Then it can be repositioned for removal. So this bolt will have to be applied with lubricating oil to ease its release by finger when necessary. Also, the transmission cooler line will have to be removed and its retainer. This is the maneuver for removing the nut completely. Once the lower bolt has been removed for the starter, shim and heat shield bracket, then that heat shield bracket will simply fall out into place for removal. So that is our bolt holding a bracket for clamping the oil cooler line. That 14mm bolt was not easy to gain access to and remove. So we can see we still do not have adequate clearance for inserting our socket onto the flywheel bolt for removal. That heat shield or dust shield must be removed in order for our socket to be placed onto the flywheel. In this area here, you will notice those two bolts, that one right there and that one is a 14, which will need removal for detaching the engine bracket from the transmission bell housing.